The siren is not the first clue. It never is. The first clue is softer than that. It's the way your spoon buzzes against the coffee mug a second longer than it should. It's the tilt you feel in your stomach that your brain writes off as an errand you forgot. It's the uncanny quiet of birds. It's the stillness of a dog that knows more than you. By the time the alarm begins its synthetic wail, by the time the recorded voice says the words it was built to say, the real conversation has already started, and it is not happening in air. It is happening in stone. You could spend a lifetime drowning in the sound of politics and never hear the planet clear its throat. The world loves its theater, its shadow puppets and glowing screens. Our attention goes to the loudest lie. Meanwhile, a signal with no interest in applause comes from below and decides to speak the language we are least prepared to hear. Alaska becomes the port of call. Not the apocalypse.
Not an omen. Something colder.
A log file with the hurtful honesty of a timestamp. An entry that reads, "Your session has been noticed."
Start with the ice.
People think ice breaks because it is weak. That's a story we tell because we like our metaphors simple. When the South Sawyer Glacier in Tracy Arm decided to let go, it did not perform a random collapse. What we saw from the tour boats, the white body caving and the blue heart sliding, looked like accident because our eyes are not trained to see arrangement. But the patterns were there. The timing, the mass, the way the slabs leaned before they fell, the way the water accepted the blow and carried it forward into a wave that did not just sweep debris but sterilized a sector. If you measure the shape of a wave in the minute after it's born, you can tell whether it is a tantrum or an intention. That day the wave had edges like handwriting. Then Juneau's backyard, the Mendenhall Glacier. Cameras love Mendenhall because it gives them everything: the reflected light, the black specks of kayaks in the foreground, the scale we can understand. What we missed was that the path of the ice that parted did not wander. The fall vector aligned with a line that points cleanly at an infrastructure not our maps politely call a capital. The wave that followed did not arrive as prophecy, it arrived as notice. Not a prediction that something could happen. A declaration that something just did. Treat it like code. Nobody likes doing that because code feels abstract and the ground under your feet has not earned the right to be abstract.
Do it anyway.
Think of discrete functions firing in sequence with a state machine holding them steady. First function, inject kinetic energy here. Second function, propagate towards the node in the graph that matters. Third function, deliver the main packet. Deliver the packet where? Not to buildings, not to roads, not to our cameras. Deliver it to the bonds that hold us to the only home we have. The main event did not look like the seismology you studied in school. That book taught you S waves, P waves, love waves, Rayleigh waves. It gave you clean diagrams. It gave you wiggles that mean reassurance. The data that came out of Alaska told another story for a handful of seconds you can count on one hand. Not vibration in the familiar sense. A vertical impulse, as if something grabbed a fistful of earth and tugged.
Not long. Not gentle.
Enough to make old laws feel like a rumor. Enough to make instruments ask, "Did you see that too?" And then the sirens. They did what sirens do. They told their pre-recorded truth in a voice that cannot be frightened because it cannot be alive. If you listened only to the sirens, you heard warning. What the ground said back was not a warning. It was a reply. People took the sound and believed it was a gift, a benevolent hand raised to the crowd. They did not understand that this was not the first speaker addressing the room.
It was the second.
Our analog mouth responding to a digital strike. We did not anger the world. That would be too easy and too human.
We did something worse.
We initiated a protocol we have no controls for. We sent too many recognizable queries into a system we thought we owned. A century of drilling, a century of extraction, a century of hammering on the same keys, and the system, which does not do anger and does not do forgiveness, launched a familiar procedure: revert to baseline. If this sounds like fantasy, listen for the part of you that knows what it means to wake a machine by accident. The part that knows the difference between rage and restoration. In the language of stone, the sentence is simple and unkind. Rolling back to factory settings. User session ending. Please remove all expectations. August came with a different kind of silence in the air. On the 13th, airlines began canceling flights across the region at a pace that made officials sound like they were reading a poem about the word unavailable. There were reasons to give the press weather at altitude, microburst predictions, risk to instruments, but the uncomfortable truth was more like this: the space we used to feel safe between air and ground was crowded with signals we do not yet know how to interpret. Shortly after, survey vessels traced with side scan and gritted teeth a rupture under the water, a fault 150 kilometers long, a blade inside the sea. Someone ran a model and the number that came out said 16 times. 16 times the wave power we call familiar. 12 months was the median of the inner circle's guesses for the time we had. People who had never been in a betting pool in their lives started counting weeks without meaning to. If you live in Alaska, the idea of a daily earthquake is not news. The earth jitters hear the way city people check their phones. You tell yourself that's background. You tell yourself the rhythm is a kind of comfort. But the truth collects like snow. This place is the seam between giants. This is subduction's church.
And the pews are not empty.
More than 100 volcanoes sit along the arc like masked singers waiting for their cue. We talk about them like single faces with single names because we like our threats to have bodies. What if the body is the necklace and not the beads?
What if the chain is the voice?
There is a phrase that has begun to circulate in rooms where geophysicists start sentences with off the record, and end them with I know how it sounds. Synchronized cascade resonance. Think of it as an upgrade from aftershocks. Not the simple decaying mirror of a main event, but a coherent shape of stress that uses the lithosphere as a medium and not just a victim. A pattern that doesn't just pass through, it finds and amplifies and selects. It speaks in harmonics across distances we once called impossible because we needed to sleep. You want a date that means something.
You will get one. March 27, 1964, Good Friday. Magnitude 9.2.
Some words should not be decorated, but this is a story that cannot resist mirrors. Good Friday turned into a sentence people used in kitchens as if it explained anything. Anchorage folded. Streets undulated like ribbon. The ocean stood up and ran. 67 meters is what the textbooks settled on for the height of a wave that should not have a height.
20 stories of cold.
The generation that survived got good at building with their hands because you have to when your city is a bruise. They told their grandchildren they lived on a powder keg. They did not talk about the match. The match might not be a spark. The match might be a memory. In 1998, someone putting a seismometer where tourists do not go and wind lives with dogs flipped through a day and flagged a noise.
Low frequency tremors near Katmai.
At the time, the paperwork said what paperwork says when it wants to be responsible and small.
Background Noase. Eis on the Move. Glacier talk.
The report served its purpose. It told nobody to panic. That should have been the end of the footnote. We are cruel to our pasts when we invent new instruments. In 2025, a team at Kyoto pulled that old line of signal out of storage and put it under a model trained on what our present calls patterns. Deep learning does not do prophecy. It does geometry at inhuman speed. The model listened and did not hear noise. It heard a structure. A stable harmonic echo whose proportions matched, uncomfortably well, the signature of 1964 squeezed in time. It should not be possible for Stone Soup to hum the chorus of a 50-year-old song.
But here we were.
The polite word in the paper draft was correlation. The impolite sentence whispered over tea with hands that had not stopped shaking was, the chamber remembered.
Who did it tell? Officially, no one.
Unofficially, everyone who needed a new fear. There are personal reasons for silence. There are also professional ones. Accepting memory at that scale means admitting that the clues were there and calling what we did for half a century by its name. We ignored them because we did not have a shelf to put them on. Build a bigger shelf. If you live on a subduction zone, you live in a machine that does two things at once. It takes the patient drag of an ocean plate and shoves it under your house. It stores that insult in rock and water. It breathes heat into chambers where futures liquefy. The energy that breaks your wall is the same energy that primes the volcano far enough away to make you call a person you have not called in months. 7 of the 10 largest earthquakes in the United States have happened along this belt. We keep saying warning as if warnings are not sometimes invitations. Pull back and imagine what a synchronized cascade actually feels like to a system as big as a plate. A large event at a key point on a fault line does not only destabilize its neighbors. It sends a packet that is more sculpture than wave. The packet is all shape and proportion, all subtlety and insistence. It moves across the repeated topology like an idea. Not a metaphorical idea. An actual distribution of strain that recognizes the path of least resistance the way water recognizes riverbeds. As it travels, it becomes an instruction for sleeping places to wake not randomly, but on time. We like to say we discovered the ring of fire. It's neater than admitting we built our lives inside its perimeter because the fishing was good and the views were extraordinary and the human heart is arrogant even in the face of lava. Everything we love about this geometry is the same geometry that will come to collect its rent all at once if cascade turns out to be the right word. This is the part of the story where the world starts making art about what it does not understand. You can measure the distance between a culture and its fear by the tone of the orchestra that plays at night. In Sydney, weeks after a 7-point-something nobody wanted to put on posters, the symphony performed a new piece called Requiem for the lithosphere written from seismic data that someone put through a translator that speaks in clefs. Reporters asked the conductor if music was meant to be beautiful. The answer did not comfort anyone. "This piece is meant to make you afraid," he said. "Not to paralyze you. To clarify you. Fear as a lens and not a prison." Students in Anchorage held debates in the kind of mixed crowd that would have laughed at itself 6 months earlier. Engineering majors brought maps and equations. Theology majors brought texts and questions with bruises on them. Geology students smiled without humor and drew diagrams on whiteboards in colors that tried and failed to be cheerful. The first question was not smart, but it was deeply true. What if the planet is one organism that can hear? The room laughed at itself for a minute and then stopped laughing because the feeling would not go away.
The feeling traveled.
A collective in Brazil built an installation called Mirrors of the Abyss where people lined up to stand inside metal chambers and feel their bones thrum to a low rhythm that approximated the deep shocks registered far north. You would watch hard men who thought they were immune to theater cry without permission. A group in California called the Voice of Gaia held quiet circles to align intentions with the ground and became a punchline for 36 hours and then something else, because sometimes practice precedes language and only later learns to defend itself. Psychologists noticed before politicians did. Aaron Bell, a clinician with a taste for questions most hospitals do not reimburse, began receiving patients whose panic did not look like fear of collapse. They were not afraid of rubble. They were afraid of not knowing how to stand on a thing that could listen. One was a structural engineer who could recite wind loads in his sleep. He sat across from Bell and said in a voice too even for calm, "My mind lives in 2 worlds now. In one, I am a man with credentials and steel in my hands. In the other, I am a child on a floor that waits for my footstep like a heartbeat." He did not ask for a diagnosis. He asked for a way to stop feeling ridiculous when the ridiculous was exactly what reality required. Science is not a shield. We used it that way for centuries because certainty is an anesthetic and anesthesia is a mercy. But the job of a method is not to stop the unknown from being unknown. The job is to make the unknown answerable without letting the answers become new cages. What Alaska invited us to consider gently at first and then with less and less patience is that the environment is not a passive room. It is not a stage without actors. It is not a background. So the experiments began. Stanford, because Stanford loves to put its fingers into things, built a controlled series of artificial blasts designed not to cut into the earth but to speak to it. Energy shaped like a question was sent toward particular fault geometries from sites permitted after more meetings than you want to imagine. The recordings did not always misbehave. 4 out of 7 trials returned what you would expect if you expected simple reflection and scattering. 3 out of 7 returned something else. The face of the signal came back altered not like scrambled audio but like a processed file. It had structure that could not be explained by the easy math. If you put your ear to the printout, it sounded like the medium had done computation. Call it an echo with an opinion. The phrase will keep you awake the first night and put you to sleep the third. You will still feel strange when you say it out loud in a room with colleagues whose faces you know as well as your own. We do not get to have a singular intelligence as our mirror here because the planet is not a brain. It does not need to be. Intelligence is a word we tie to creatures that act and want and name themselves. Remove the wanting and the naming and the acting. Keep the emergence. Life finds many ways to look like a mind. Fungus threads a forest into a contract without signatures. Schools of fish move like a decision without a decider. You can scale these behaviors up and up until you reach heat and pressure and mineral lattice and still find pattern that adapts, stores and replies. We are early. The theories are toddlers with large heads and unsteady legs. One approach that gets whispered with apology is topological coupling in geological systems. It sounds like jargon because it is. Translate it into something a tired person can hold. Traditional seismology draws a picture of waves. It watches peaks and troughs travel like a thrown rope. Topological methods do not watch the rope. They look for shapes that persist when you change your perspective. They ask which features cannot be undone by noise. Imagine an earthquake not as a sound but as a sculpture turning slowly in a room. The sculpture reveals different truths as you walk around it, but the sculpture remains itself. If Alaska received not a single shock but a form, If what moved through the crust was not only energy but instruction coded in invariance, if the stress packet carried a glyph and not just a shove, then you can understand why a machine trained to see shape constancy in high dimensions might see a sentence where we saw a scream. None of this proves intention. All of it proves behavior. Behavior at scales that refuse to care what we call them. Begin to see the consequences, and your hand will reach for a pen before your chest remembers to breathe. Building codes will need to change, but not only to withstand acceleration. They will need to consider a structure's signature as a participant. The way a tower's foundations hum in storms may be read by the medium. The rhythmic flogging of megacities might be a broadcast we have been sending without noticing. You will see planners talk about materials in a new way. Not as passive, but as messages. You will hear civil engineers fight themselves in private because the idea deforms how they learn to love their craft. You will watch them come back to the table and do the work anyway because that is who they are. Geological agencies that have spent a century being the quiet guardians of bad news will begin to write memos that belong to a different department. Not only monitoring, but etiquette. Not only sirens, but manners. Not only evacuations, but conversations. They will explore a phrase that will make your hair rise the first time you read it and sound normal a month later. Geological diplomacy. Not a treaty with a person. Protocols with a medium. A way of behaving so that our presence does not read like vandalism to the instrument we live in. The culture will shove this into the story it knows how to tell first. Punishment. When people do not understand a system, they reach for gods. That move has its dignity. It is not the only move. There are scientists who will, with compassion and with good reasons, talk about the planet answering our trespass. If this gives you a way to behave better, take it. If it makes you forget that this system does not accuse and does not forgive, it will cost you later. The clearest voice in the dark is the one that says, this is not wrath. This is response. That does not make it kinder. It makes it fairer. By now you may be wondering if there is a villain in this story. There is not. There is a protagonist, and it is scale. Everything else glaciers, sirens, governments, artists, prayers is a chorus that can rise to grace if it listens well. The listening turns out to be the hard part. If you write down every tremor and every exhale of a volcano and every sigh of a glacier, you quickly discover that data hoards without meaning. We are good at hoarding. We are less good at meaning. Meaning appears when two things look back at each other and do not flinch. The shock on the 13th of August had numbers attached to it. Numbers are not cowards. The discovery of a long underwater fault capable of acts we pretend ocean water cannot perform had numbers attached to it. Those numbers produced a set of calendars and deadlines and budgets and screamed emails. There were also the silences. The long stare of a 62-year-old seismologist who has learned to stand in front of a screen without letting his face become a sermon. He told a young colleague that there was a second, longer than a second, on one of the recordings where it felt like the deep stopped and thought of us. He said it like he knew it would end up in a book he did not want to write. We have to talk about the 1970 towns and the 20th century bargains and the 21st century fantasies. We built cities where river deltas announced themselves with silt and wonder. We threw neighborhoods at slopes that have been practicing cunning since before grass learned patience. We laid fiber and called it permanent in grounds where permanence is a joke told with love. None of this is sin. All of it is our childhood. The day after emergency declarations in Anchorage and its kin, the internet did what it does. Forum threads began with the brittle ironies of people who are good at being clever when they are frightened. It took 13 comments for someone to say the quiet part. What if the planet is not empty? The words did not mean creatures. They meant context. They meant processes that are smarter than we are at being processes. The comment thread evolved as threads do, with kindness that looked like aggression and cruelty that looked like help. But somewhere in there, a dozen people who would have never spoken in the same room began to speak like they were in the same room. That counts. If you find yourself grieving during this story, it is not only for the buildings. It is for the idea that the ground is neutral. The most dangerous myth we inherited and were happy to pay forward is that nature is a stage equipped with fresh air. We made plans as if neutrals could be managed. When you feel that idea die in you, do not try to resuscitate it. Something better is trying to breathe. It goes like this. We are not alone and we were never in control. This has always been true. Now it is useful. In the edges of the academy where money is scarce and curiosity is a currency, people have been gesturing toward this for years without catching fire. They talk about distributed cognition and emergent response. They point to ice sheets and their oscillations that defy simple drivers. They whisper about mantle plumes that appear to tap patterns beyond our clocks. Now those people are receiving emails they were not receiving in spring. The emails do not say you were right. They say, we need your language. Language will be the battlefield. Our metaphors will decide whether this moment sharpens us or breaks us. Call it a system rollback if that steadies your hand. The metaphor works because we have taught ourselves to think of complex networks as machines we can restart. It is not perfect, but it will do. You can also call it homeostasis with teeth. You can call it a basin of attraction we have wandered out of with the confidence of a teenager. You can say it simpler and say it better. The planet is returning to a set point with or without us. Does this mean doom?
No. It means terms. Terms we do not set. Terms we can influence.
If we can learn to be quiet where quiet helps and loud where loud saves, if we can teach our engines to hum in frequencies that read as apology instead of threat, if we can stop using stone as a drum we pound for the pleasure of hearing our own rhythm, we might discover that the conversation we fear is not even a confrontation. It is a calibration. If the idea makes your stomach roll like it did when we started, breathe. You are allowed to feel small. You are not allowed to feel useless.
One more time visse facts wie ken Holt vitut romangs.
Alaska is where an ocean plate slides beneath a continent. That sliding stores energy and releases it in ways that become catalogs and tragedies. One of those ways is a quake so large our instruments get shy. Another is a chain of volcanoes close enough together to be cousins and far enough apart to pretend they are strangers. Daily tremors are the system's chatter. Periodic violent events are its corrections. Add to this a new branch of sensing that looks for patterns in how those corrections travel. Add a handful of studies that suggest waves can sometimes carry shapes that do more than bruise. Add a half-dozen off-the-record briefings where scientists agree to behave like writers just long enough to say, if this is a message, it is not a sentence. It is a pressure that arranges. From here, the applications blossom like weeds and medicine plants in the same rain. Telecom companies will notice that their undersea cables fail in pulses that match deep tides more elegantly than our old schedules want to admit. Energy grids will begin to budget for the hum of ground not as noise but as partner. Architects will remember that resonance is not only a theater trick but a boundary of kindness. City councils will pass laws that sound like rituals. We will set curfews not for people but for machines that stomp and signal after midnight. Someone will write an op-ed mocking it. Someone else will write a memo that saves a neighborhood. In closed rooms where a sense of humor goes to die, teams will attempt the first rough drafts of what an answer looks like. Not a huge machine to plug into a fault. Not a miracle to stop a quake.
A handshake. The simplest packet.
Short sequences of low-frequency pulses delivered through arrays you could build from off-the-shelf equipment and stubbornness. The goal will not be to change a fate. It will be to establish a rhythm, to train the system not to hear us as static. We will do this not because we want to believe in magic, but because we have learned that silence is an insult when a conversation is possible. You will ask who will be in charge of this. You will wish the answer were easy. It will not be a single agency. It will be a net of people who barely tolerate each other and learn to write emails that read like prayers.
There will be mistakes. There will be frauds.
There will be people who try to sell candles that glow when the mantle says your name. There will also be craftspersons who bring a new kind of humility to the table and quietly save a town by adjusting a frequency in the subbasement of a dam. You will hear the word humility used so often it becomes almost hostile. Practice it anyway. The point is not to shrink until you disappear.
The point is to fit.
A friend will ask you if you miss the old story. The one where we walk onto land and name it and tame it and make it ours. You will tell them the truth. You do not miss a story that was never true. You miss the part where you could pretend it was. The test will be simple and hard. When the next large correction starts to build, when you feel the spoon tremble in your cup, when the siren practices its lonely courage, will we shout at our screens or will we lower our voices? Will we hear the first clue in time for it to matter? Nobody gets to answer that from a podium. The answer is not a policy.
It is a posture.
You will know it when you see the 7th grade science teacher turn to the class and say, quietly, before we begin, put your hands on the desk and feel the table. It is connected to the floor. The floor is connected to the ground. The ground is moving all the time. Today we will talk about how that is not an enemy but a fact. You will know it when you watch a politician step to a microphone and tell the truth we hired them to tell. We do not control this. We can adapt to this. We will do the first because it is right and the second because it is necessary. And the mysteries will remain. The memory at Katmai that should not be. The packet that is a sculpture and not a shout. The 3 experiments that came back with the wrong kind of echo. The 30 questions that follow those 3. The old man in the control room who thought he heard the deep think of us and will now be remembered for that sentence whenever he did not ask to be remembered for any sentence at all. There is a lovelier line hiding inside this, and it is shy, and it does not want to be used as a slogan. Here it is anyway. We are not only a species that asks the sky for answers. We are a species that is learning to hear the ground. The ground speaks without words. It speaks in timing and in shapes and in harm. It speaks in the way ice lets go in just the right way to make a harbor clean without caring that the harbor belongs to us. It speaks in the direction of melt and the selection of when to slip. It speaks in the distribution of 1,000 daily quakes that are not meaningless, just below the threshold we have time for. It speaks, and when we line up the graphs and ask the programs to see what we cannot, they return with a few clear phrases. The lithosphere remembers.
The mantle ruhtes. The plates reply.
It will be tempting, so tempting to dress this up as fate. To say that the end has already begun and we are actors in a play about punishment. The human mind does love a tragedy with a chorus. Push back where you need to. Leave room for grace. A synchronized cascade does not have to be an execution. It can be a curriculum. We earned our first failing grade the day we pounded the ground and thought it could not hear. We can do better on the second test without pretending we know the questions.
The year will turn.
The 12-month clock someone wrote down in an email will haunt your calendar, and then, when the date arrives, the worst will not occur in exactly the way the PDF foresaw. Some will call that a victory.
Some will call it luck.
The wiser name is variance. The system is not a boss who keeps appointments. It is a weather that develops what it needs in timeframes we cannot read. In the meantime, 1,000 smaller things will change. Municipalities along coastlines will quietly upgrade their tide gauges with sensors meant to hear the sculpture of stress and not only the swell. Emergency planners will establish dim rooms where the lights are too gentle and sleep is allowed because the brain that needs to recognize an echo with an opinion cannot be starved and expect to sing. Artists will keep translating. Priests who have not slept well will learn to pray in new ways. Children will draw the earth with ears, and their parents will laugh and then stop laughing and hang the drawings on the fridge because sometimes children are the most indecently accurate metaphor we have. In the lab at Stanford where the experiments misbehaved, they will run them again and again, and on the 15th try it will look like the first 4 and someone will weep from relief. On the 16th, an anomaly will flicker and the heartbreak will continue like weather. In Kyoto, the model will be retrained with data from months we are living through now, and it will produce a map that looks like a secret and nobody will know if it is a map or an illusion until the world decides to write an answer and send it upstairs for us to read. If this sounds like a life, it is. The good news is that we will get good at it. The bad news is that we will remember too much. There will be funerals. There are always funerals. A single wave will be too tall for a single cove. A hillside that has been supposed to hold will stop pretending. A town with a proud name will wear grief like a uniform for a season. We will bring food and tools.
We will hold each other.
We will stare at the ruined angle of a road we thought was stubborn and make peace with the shame that comes when we realize we have been lucky for longer than we deserved. You might want an ending.
You will not get one.
You will get a rhythm. At some point late, when the adrenaline has turned into a lake and the lake is not drinkable, you will hear a new kind of quiet in the air. The siren will still be tested once a month. The birds will still decide together when to leave a tree. Your spoon will still hum on a bad morning. But running under all of that, you will sense that something has shifted in how we stand. A culture can tilt and not fall. The tilt is away from dominance and towards conversation. The tilt is away from paranoia and toward attention. The tilt is away from pretending we are the author and toward delighting that we are a line in a book larger than our shelves. Before sleep, you will do a small thing you have never done before and cannot explain to yourself without sounding silly.
You will put your hand on the floor.
You will whisper thank you to a ground that does not need gratitude and cannot use it.
You will feel foolish. You will also feel right.
Somewhere not far, not near, not anywhere you can put a pin into a map, there will be a slow rearrangement of pressures that continue to play their long game and continue to ignore your kindness. The point is not that the earth hears your word. The point is that you hear your life inside a living medium. People who use their lives to count, to model, to stare at blinking cursors until blinking means nothing, will continue to do what they do. If they are very lucky, if we are very lucky, they will write new lines in old codes. They will adjust the way we build and the way we blast and the way we signal. They will help us become inhabitants instead of owners. They will be thanked less than they deserve.
Thank them anyway.
They will not save us from the truth that the world corrects itself. They will help us learn to be corrected without breaking. There is a line that returns like a tide and always sounds like arrogance when I say it and always turns into a prayer when I am alone.
We are being seen.
By what, is not a person's to say. By a medium that recognizes patterns like a forest does. By a set of processes that do not sleep, that do not care, that answer anyway. We are being seen, and learning to be seen is worse than danger and better than safety. It is reality. If you need to carry one sentence out of this room when you go, make it this one.
The Silence is full of understanding.
It has always been. What is changing is us. We are learning to hear it.
And so the story does not end. It breates.
It continues as the plates slide and as the glaciers decide and as the faults argue and make up while nobody is watching. It continues in Anchorage and Sydney and Kyoto and Stanford and in your kitchen when the spoon tells you more than the news would. It continues when someone brave enough to be ridiculous suggests that we shape our cities not only to endure shocks, but to speak less rudely when we vibrate. It continues when a conductor asks an orchestra to frighten us in the right way and a therapist listens to an engineer who cannot stop imagining the floor thinking. It continues when a young scientist hears an echo that should not be there and chooses curiosity over career. It continues when an old scientist closes his eyes for a second too long in front of a screen and decides that what he felt was not holiness and not madness but the simple gravity of being included. At 3 a.m. in a control room that smells like exhaustion and pencil shavings and borrowed sweaters, a graph will scroll past with a blip that carries a shape only a few eyes on Earth can recognize. One of those eyes will belong to you if you want it to. You will not save the world.
You will meet it.
You will say without trumpet or drum, I am listening. And the world will do what it always does. It will roll its shoulders and adjust its weight and continue to practice the same conversation it has been having since basalt learned to love the ocean. The last sound before you sleep will not be the siren. It will be the house settling around you like a companion. It will be the far, low voice of a continent telling you what it has always told you. You are not alone. That is not a threat. That is the beginning of a life worth living.